CrossCode, created by developer Radical Fish Games, is an ARPG heavily imbued with puzzle-based elements. In some ways, it feels a lot like the older 2D Zelda titles, but whereas Link interacts with the world mainly by using his sword, the protagonist Lee interacts with the world mainly by shooting energy spheres. Now why spheres? Well, that has a lot to do with CrossCode's story and setting. The game itself takes place within the MMORPG of the future called Crossworlds, and the main character Lee is one of the players. She's an amnesiac trying to regain her memory with the help of her behind-the-scenes supporter, Sergey. And since before her memory loss, she was apparently a heavy player of Crossworlds, the hope is that by playing, she'll find things that trigger her memory. Along the way, you'll meet new people, find new party members, see interesting things, and slowly uncover fragments of your past. The story does take a few unexpected turns and have some major plot twists, but it's not my place to say what they are. I will say that there's a yet unfinished epilogue chapter to the story that I wished was available at release, since the ending doesn't quite wrap things up as cleanly as it could. And perhaps just as interesting as the story is the setting. Crossworlds is indeed an MMORPG, but it doesn't take place inside a virtual world. Instead, the creator company, called Instantainment, has purchased and isolated an island on a habitable moon, and by utilizing both physical construction and a programmable lightweight substance called instant matter, have quite literally built the game's playground. Players then roam around this playground using instant matter avatars, talk with instant matter NPCs, and fight instant matter enemies. This partly real, partly digital aspect ends up creating some interesting scenarios within the game. Since Crossworlds is still an MMORPG, it's filled with its own story, background lore, and a class-based character system. Lee is the class known as a Spheromancer, one of 5 shape-themed character classes. The Spheromancer is known mainly for, you guessed it, shooting spheres, but can also use circular blades for close combat and has a well-rounded balance of skills. There isn't any option to change classes, but this isn't supposed to be a feature, because while Crossworlds might be an MMORPG, CrossCode is still a game following the story of Lee, whose class is pre-decided for a reason, and progressing through the MMO helps push her story forward. As for the bulk of what you'll be doing in this game, the gameplay has 2 major types: combat and puzzle solving. Being an ARPG, the combat is fast and in real time, where you utilize 4 distinct actions: dashing, guarding, melee attacks, and once again, shooting spheres that account for your ranged attacks. Each of these 4 actions also have a skill tree that imbues them with special moves that vary from shooting a volley of spheres to dashing through an enemy and doing a multi-hit combo on them. As you progress through the game, you also unlock 4 different element types, each of which have their own skill trees and subsequently even more varied and unique skills, like creating a shield of ice or spinning around with a big blade of electricity. These element skills, while stronger than the base skills, can only be used for a limited time as you risk overloading with element energy. Combat can also include up to 2 party members, each with skills and preferences of their own. But don't expect to rely on them for everything, because they won't be there for the game's dungeons, where the more intense fights occur. These dungeons are also the primary location of the more serious puzzle-based gameplay. There are a total of 7 dungeons in the game, the tutorial dungeon, then 5 element-related dungeons, and then a final dungeon. There are technically 8, though the 8th will likely be related to that epilogue chapter I mentioned. The puzzles in these dungeons are created by either introducing a new design element or taking a previous element and using it in a new and more complex manner. Take the second element dungeon. Pretty early on, you're introduced to 3 different design elements: these elemental pillars, these floating water balls, and these quicksand floors you sink into. You're introduced to each one of these elements in a rather safe environment, but figure out how they work on your own. Pretty quickly, these design elements start becoming more complex. The elemental pillars are introduced first, the water balls second, and then you hit this puzzle that combines the 2 together. Elemental pillars then take a different turn as they now have versions that alter the height of your projectile. And after being introduced to the sinking sands, they then take a different turn as you now have sand that can sink you down a floor. which all then culminates into a puzzle that uses water balls, height-shifting elemental pillars, and sinking sands all at the same time, while also utilizing an elemental shifting orb that was first introduced in a prior dungeon. And all of these design elements are just in the first half of the level. After beating the mid-boss and acquiring the ice element power, the dungeon adds these water pillars, steam pipes, and water balls now have a different use by freezing them into hockey pucks. If that weren't enough, many of the rooms in these dungeons also include optional treasure boxes filled with useful items and equipment that often require you to use a room's puzzle in a different and sometimes more complex manner. All of these design elements are not limited to puzzle rooms either. Taking a step back into CrossCode's combat, you'll find that most combat engagements are also infused with puzzle elements. Outside of dungeons, the normal enemies can have their defenses broken by hitting them at certain times with certain attacks or element types, or be countered by blocking at the correct time or inflicting specific status effects. Each enemy will have their own specific weaknesses, so finding and exploiting that weakness is part of the fun of combat. Inside of dungeons, this goes a step further by merging the level design elements with the action combat. Those three design elements I mentioned first, water balls, sinking sands, and elemental pillars, well, each of those also have a unique combat encounter. Water balls are used to break the defenses of these jellyfish enemies, elemental pillars are how you can drag these moth enemies down to ground level, and you have to fight these disturbing worm creatures while avoiding the sandy hazards. Likewise, the dungeon's boss also takes one or more of these elements to be used during their lengthy, multi-layered fights. By creatively evolving old design elements and introducing new ones, while also merging them for use in both the standard puzzle rooms and the real-time combat, CrossCode manages to create dungeons that feel fresh as you progress through the game. My only real complaint with these dungeons is that sometimes they rely on puzzles that require both timing and precise sphere accuracy, which is something that can't always be done reliably, as sphere throwing needs both a specific standing location and aiming location to accurately hit your mark. On that note, these puzzle dungeons are also a prime example of how Lee interacts with the world heavily through the use of sphere throwing. The elemental pillars are used by throwing spheres, the water balls too, but you also hit switches with spheres, unlock doors by shooting key spheres, you push blocks by shooting charged spheres, among so many other things. Moving on, while dungeons probably take up about a third of the gameplay, the other 2/3 are exploration of the many different biomes and the various side quests that are offered. As for exploration, there are 7 different locations of varying different sizes that range from disturbed purple swamps to wintry snow-covered mountains to thick bamboo forests. These areas are filled with a multitude of different enemies, treasures, and plants that drop valuable resources. Like the dungeons, these areas include a lot of puzzles and combat. Combat outside of dungeons is, like I said, much less involved with the puzzle aspects, but instead the types of enemies are greater in both variety and quantity. The goal of the free combat here is to gain experience, money, and the more useful trade-in items. These trade-in items are how you acquire the stronger weapons and armor that have special skills attached beyond just the base stats. On that note, exploratory combat also has another layer to it in the form of the combat rank. This rank determines the rarity and drop rate of trade-in items and can be increased by chaining battles together into one large killing spree. This is more dangerous than it seems though, because outside of battle, your health would normally regenerate to its max. But by creating a battle chain, you remove that health regeneration, so you have to rely on healing food items, which are slow to activate and have a delay between uses, thus increasing your chance of death and subsequently the loss of all items and experience gained during that killing spree. Perhaps the only real downside of exploratory combat is that, unlike dungeon combat, the battles here can be very messy. Lots of visual effects, obscuring environment art, and way too many opponents on screen can make it hard to discern when an enemy is attacking, which makes dodging, blocking, and the overall exploitation of an enemy's weakness somewhat of a struggle. The puzzle aspect of exploration is also less involved as it is in dungeons, and focuses heavily on jumping puzzles. Jumping mazes might be a better way of putting it though, since they involve finding a path to higher ground and working your way across other raised platforms and past puzzle blockades till you get to your goal. In most cases, that goal is a treasure box, but you can find plants with rare drops, shortcuts that make traversal easier, and even secret areas. Much like the combat in these areas, jumping can be a bit messy due to what's happening visually. The problem in this case has to do with perspective. Depending on the location of the screen and the color of the background, it can be difficult to tell when certain platforms are on the same height level, making you waste your time by wrongly bailing off high ground and having to repeat the jumps over again. I feel like this problem could have been solved by making different height platforms have different colored floors, which would allow for someone to tell the height at a glance, but the most you can do right now is use the sphere trajectory line to test the height yourself, inconvenient as that might be. Connected to these various exploratory areas are towns and rest areas. These locations are where you can buy and trade in materials for new items, and where you're going to acquire most of the side quests this game has to offer. As far as the quests go, CrossCode has managed to avoid one of the great pitfalls of RPGs and not have all the quests feel samey. There are still simple fetch quests and the like, but they stand in the minority. The rest of the quests, despite having simple objectives, have greatly varied gameplay. In some cases, that may involve mini-dungeons that expand even further upon the designs of the major dungeons, or include even more difficult jumping segments. In other cases, battles are souped up with different objectives or challenges, like having a battle be reworked into a tower defense game, or needing to carefully rescue hostages from a bunch of gun-toting bird gangsters. Some quests even have their own mini-narratives, though much to my dismay, the end of one of those narratives is also locked behind that epilogue chapter I mentioned. As far as CrossCode's art and music goes, the songs are all well written, with each area, town, dungeon, and even specific story events having their own unique themes. Though I do wish that some of the dungeon and area music wasn't perhaps quite so peaceful when compared to the other parts of the game, as the contrast can feel odd at times. And the art, despite considering itself retro-styled, looks better than anything the Super Nintendo ever put out, only the walking sprites really seem to capture that aesthetic. Though I would like to point out one of the more important things that Radical Fish did with the art in this game. A part of the story I have yet to mention is that Lee's character, due to a programming glitch, is effectively mute. She can say some words thanks to her supporter Sergey, but even by the end of the game, the amount of words she can speak could be counted on your hands. Because of this, Radical Fish Games lets you see how she feels through the use of non-verbal communication, as all dialogue is accompanied by waist-up character portraits that change depending on Lee's emotions. With this, you can see when she's feeling happy, sad, angry, or even cocky, impressed, or afraid. The list goes on much farther than that, too. The other major characters get this treatment as well, but not quite to the extent that Lee does, and having this artistic feature really makes the silent protagonist trope interesting, especially when the entire story has to be told in that manner. As a whole, though, CrossCode manages to deliver an impressive experience, from interesting puzzles and dynamic combat to an interesting story told in an unusual setting. This is especially impressive when considering that this is the first release by Radical Fish Games. Putting out something this creative and of such quality on a first attempt is something that truly deserves praise. All I ask of them now is that they make that epilogue chapter, and all the other content that comes with it, worth the extra wait.